Hi, I'm John DeDakis, and you're one-to-one with me. And I have to say, before I go any farther, we had technical difficulties the last time, and we've had to, in a sense, reboot and start over again because I'm one-to-one with Judge Russell Canan. And he is a very interesting person. Let me just tell you a little bit about him. He is the author of the just released memoir, Pursuing the Horizon: Stories of Justice. Judge Canan was appointed to the Superior Court of the District of Columbia in 1993 by President Bill Clinton. Before his elevation to the bench, Judge Canan was a criminal defense and civil litigation attorney in D.C., Maryland, and throughout the South. In 1983, he has helped establish the Southern Center for Human Rights in Atlanta, where he represented prisoners on death row. Judge Canan is the former presiding judge of the D.C. Criminal Division and chaired a committee that studied wrongful convictions and proposed reforms. And in addition to his memoir, Judge Canan is a co-editor and co-author of the book Tough Cases: Judges Tell the Stories of Some of the Hardest Decisions That They've Ever Made. So, Judge Canan, thank you very much for being here. It's great to be able to grill you, I guess you could say, on your career on the bench. So, what are some of what is the hardest case you've ever had to try?
Well, thank you, John, and I appreciate being invited to come on this program. For full disclosure, John, I've been a student of John at the Writers Center, and for this new book, Pursuing Justice, Pursuing the Horizon: Stories of Justice, John helped edit the book. So if you find any errors in the book, so you'll know where to go and who to point the finger at. That'll be you, John.
Yeah, right. Okay, fine.
And I also want to say I'm part of the John DeDakis fan club, and I've read 2 of the Lark Chadwick novels. I've have the 3rd one right here. I know I'm supposed to be promoting my own book, but I'm going to give John a shout out here. Troubled Water, the 3rd of the 5th of the Lark Chadwick mystery stories. They're wonderful reads.
Thank you.
So thank you, John, for all you've done for.
Thank you. Am I getting the law right when I'm writing these things?
You made a few tiny mistakes. You should have checked with me first, you know.
I didn't know you at the time, so I will in the future. But okay. Let's talk about your book. Actually, your books. The one that's out right now. Let's just take a look at the cover if I can. Let me see if I can. How am I going to do this? I want to share my screen. This is a very low budget operation, Judge. For some reason, I'm not able to share my screen. I don't know why. I can do it like that. I can. Oh, I know. There. Okay. There's your cover, and you took the picture. Am I right?
I did. I took it in Tasmania, Australia, and when we were trying to work on a title for the book, and I always like the backstories when I go to these book talks from various authors, the behind the scenes things which you not necessarily learn in the book. And for a while I was going to use the title Pursuing Justice, which comes from Deuteronomy: justice, justice you shall pursue. Mm-hmm. And then about several months ago, my sister said, "You have Googled that name, haven't you?" And to which I replied, "Duh." And when I did, I found out there were many, many books called Pursuing Justice. And
shows you had a good idea. It shows you had a good idea.
Right. I found out as a lawyer, I didn't know anything about the copyright. It's not a copyright problem. So I could have used it if I really insisted upon it. And the publisher from 12 Tables Press has been fabulous, Steve Eric. He would have done it with me if he thought, but I think we both thought it'd be better to have an original title. And this photograph is in my study here. It's a picture of the horizon, and I thought it was an apt metaphor for justice, because the horizon, you can never fully obtain the horizon, you can never quite reach it. And justice also is something that you can never quite reach in all its phases. It's something you always want to reach, you aspire to reach. Doesn't mean you shouldn't try to reach it. but I think it's a worthy goal. And I also came across a Stephen Crane poem called "Pursuing the Horizon." So it all came together quite nicely. So "Pursuing the Horizon: Story of Justice" became the title. And I guess your question was my toughest case, which is a reprint from the first book you referred to, called "Rough Justice." Rough Justice is in the book Tough Cases, and that's a book that came out over 2 years ago. And it was a book that came about after two of my colleagues and I were having dinner at our favorite Italian restaurant, and we talked about our hardest cases and thought that it might be advantageous to put out a book for the general public, for the general readership, to get a behind-the-scenes look at what goes on when judges make their decisions, because I know and think that it's probably most of the public think it's somewhat mysterious how judges come to their conclusions. And we each wrote a chapter, we passed them along to each other, we somewhat said immodestly we thought they were pretty good, and we were able to pass them along to some friends of ours in the media and some friends in academia. And one friend, Professor Angela Davis, liked the chapters and referred them to the New Press, which is a public interest nonprofit trade press in New York City. And they're thought of somewhat as the NPR or PBS of publishing. Professor Davis sent our chapters to the editor, the boss, Diane Wachtel. She sent us an email several days later saying, "I love these chapters, let's talk." Well, we knew nothing about the publishing business, but we did know enough to know it's very hard to get a book published these days. And, with things happen very fast, and Ms. Wachtel liked the chapters. Our original thought was that we would get chapters from DC Superior Court, our court, behind the scenes in a urban, gritty court with a million stories to tell. But she told us that the book would be more dynamic, which we quickly learned is publisher speak for marketable, if we got judges from around the country. So we sought to find judges around the country, a diverse group of judges and backgrounds and history and cultures, also diverse types of cases. So we've got well-known cases such as the Scooter Libby case, the Elian Gonzalez case, the Terry Schiavo case. Yeah. We have some cases that are well-known in their jurisdictions but not nationally, and some cases like mine, Rough Justice, which isn't known at all. So we have judges from Houston, Texas, and Los Angeles, California, Seattle, Washington, Minnesota, Michigan, New York City. One of the judges, Ed Wilson, actually, he's from Minnesota, but his chapter, Building Justice in Kosovo, takes place while he was an international judge in Kosovo shortly after the genocide and trying to rebuild a whole new system of justice.
What made your particular case tough?
Judges take an oath to follow the law, and that's an oath that I take very seriously. And I've never intentionally not followed the law and done something that I wanted to do because that's what I thought was best.
Is it tempting, though, to do that?
Yeah, of course it is. And, judges, especially state court judges who have many cases to hear and difficult cases. For instance, in our court, we take turns sitting in landlord-tenant court. And large part of the individuals, the tenants who the landlords are seeking to evict, don't have lawyers. And the vast majority of them are there because they can't pay the rent, notwithstanding what life's vicissitudes happen. They lost their job, the husband dies, some tragedy happens through really no fault of their own. They just can't pay the rent. Mm-hmm. But poverty is not a defense in that kind of case. And so I think every judge feels that I've never felt more like an instrument of the system than I do when I'm mm-hmm. sitting in a landlord-tenant court, mm-hmm. where you feel like you're validating an economic system or a legal system to make the system work. And I feel very bad for tenants who get evicted from their homes. And I felt particularly bad since a lot of them don't have lawyers. And we're trying very hard very hard through the local law schools and having the bar become pro bono lawyers, work for free. So we're really trying hard to have an access to justice so that those individuals can. So, but
So I
I'd
think
say
that
most judges do feel
what I'm hearing you saying is that even though you may have a frustration about a case that you're trying to do, you can try to reform the system as opposed to legislate from the bench.
exactly. And the case that I write about, it's a reprint from Tough Cases, but it is in the new book, Pursuing Justice, deals with the age-old problem of, do the ends justify the means if the ends are just? And just very quickly, the basic facts was the defendant, who was 40 years old, had no criminal record. He was a working man, I believe at a Giant or a Safeway, and he was a single father of two teenagers, young teenage girls. And one thing led to another. There was a dispute with a young man who claimed that this defendant, who I call Sam, took out a gun and shot him in the thigh. And I didn't think the government's case was very compelling, but it was a jury trial, so the jury is the one who makes the decision. And had I tried the case without a jury, I would have easily found him not guilty. And but the jury gave us a glimpse of their reasoning, and it became quite clear to me, both the prosecutor and the defense lawyer, that the jury was going to find him guilty of a crime that was going to carry a 5-year mandatory sentence. And so I encouraged the lawyers to try to work out some kind of a deal, because I didn't feel a 5-year sentence, or any sentence, quite frankly, for this defendant was fair, much less a 5-year mandatory sentence. And to much surprise, the jury was deliberating. In fact, the jury announced that they had reached a verdict, but we didn't know what the verdict was. So the defendant was pleading guilty before me, and that's a process where I have to be sure the defendant knowingly, voluntarily, and intelligently is waiving his rights. And one of the questions that's asked is whether or not you've been promised anything. He was able to plead, and this was the key part, to a major felony, but that felony that he was pleading guilty to did not carry a mandatory sentence, much less a 5-year sentence. And as I was asking him this question, I realized that I had really, through the back door, had promised him he wasn't going to go to prison for 5 years. And had I crossed the line, had I violated my oath, had I done something to achieve justice, a kind of what we call rough justice, was that the right thing to do? Should I do it? The defendant wanted to do it. His lawyer wanted to do it. I wanted him to do it. Even the prosecutor thought it was the fair result, but still may have violated the law. So that was my tough case, my toughest case, and I guess I'll leave it like that. If you want to find out what I did, you can buy the book.
I read the chapter, and I don't know how you do it. I mean, how do you get to sleep at night? Being able to have to discern some of these things.
I think everyone who's been a trial lawyer and a trial judge goes through a lot of very difficult situations in the courtroom and in practicing law. And I think trial judges and trial lawyers, and because I think all trial lawyers have similar, in some ways the trial lawyers is the easy job, and they're very hard, don't get me wrong, to be a prosecutor and have the weight of a victim on your side and doing justice for that victim, or a criminal defense lawyer, as I was, and having someone sometimes literally their life in your hands. So those are incredible responsibilities. But your duty is to go forward, go fast forward, especially for a criminal defense lawyer. Do what you can ethically, what you can do. Prosecutors got to make sure they're acting ethically too, but their job is to put their best case forward, and the judges got to make those tough decisions. So I think judges have really, in the last 10 years, have thought seriously about the weight of the burnout factor, and judges talk about it now a lot. There are programs and educational sessions that are set up because it has become a phenomenon that judges have to be aware of.
In the last 4 years or so, there have been attacks on really all institutions, the judiciary, the intelligence community, journalism, the medical community, science. Um, is that discouraging? Does that affect you as you sit on the bench? Is it? Are you seeing indications that there is an increasing distrust in the about distrust of the judiciary?
I think there is much more so than it ever had been and used to be. I think it probably still is. The judiciary is of the three branches of government, executive, legislative, and judicial. I think if you believe polls, and of course sometimes we have to be very careful about polls these days, but the judiciary always ranked as the most respected of the three branches of government. But it's taken its hits for sure. Now some of it, quite frankly, has been self-inflicted. And by that I mean these TV judges, these TV programs, don't do justice to the law. I mean, they really don't. I've only watched a couple of them a few times just to see what they were about. And quite frankly, I was appalled by it. Mm-hmm. And so being a TV judge has not enhanced the dignity of the bench. Mm-hmm. Also, many jurisdictions have TVs in the courtroom, which we don't have that in DC Superior Court or in the federal courts. I'm actually in the minority of my court. I actually think we should have it, but there's so much stuff out there on the internet, on YouTube and wherever about judges behaving badly on the bench. I would think that knowing you're on camera and being recorded would have a deterring effect, but for some people it just doesn't.
Well, and it's an accountability thing too to have a camera there, don't you think?
Yeah, you would think so, but it wouldn't take you long to find some pretty outrageous conduct by judges around the country.
Did you always know that you wanted to be a judge? How did that come about? I mean, obviously the law is one thing, but then, being on the bench, that's a notch above. So how did that come about?
It was not an ambition of mine, and indeed my career as a largely criminal defense lawyer, I ended up specializing in doing death penalty cases, some of which were very high profile, and that's not the usual path to the bench, and especially in DC where it's a three-part system. There's what's called a nomination commission that recommends three names to the president. The nomination commission is really nonpartisan, and most people consider that, completely merit-based. When it gets to the White House, that's a different story. And then after the White House, you have to be confirmed by the Senate. So, the typical path to the bench was not being, one, a criminal defense lawyer, but two, involved in death penalty cases, some of which were quite high profile and controversial at the time. I'll never forget a judge named Robert Schuker who really became a mentor to me, and he had been a former assistant United States attorney. I think most people consider in his time he was the best trial lawyer the U.S. Attorney's Office had. And we both broke in, him on the bench and me as a defense lawyer, and our careers kind of tracked each other through juvenile court, misdemeanor court, serious felony courts. I moved up as he moved up and had murder trials before him, and he called me up one day out of the blue and said, "You want to go to lunch?" I said, "Lunch with Judge Schuker?" This was unfathomable to me. Uh-huh. And we sat down at lunch. He said, "I think you have the stuff to be a good judge, to be an excellent judge. Why don't you apply?" And once he said that, I figured that if I had the support of him and other colleagues, that perhaps I could do this, and it would be a calling. I've always thought very highly of most judges, thought it'd be an excellent way to serve the community. And although you don't have quite as much power as it seems to the lay public, at least you have the ability to affect individual cases and to do justice.
One of the things that I think is interesting about your story is that you were President Clinton's first judicial nominee, if I'm not mistaken, and that John McCain was very viscerally opposed to you. But that's an interesting story, and I wonder if you wouldn't mind sharing that.
Sure. So much of the present book deals with principles of mercy and forgiveness and redemption. And because I had this death penalty background, and I had written about the death penalty, and I spoke out about the death penalty when my Senate confirmation came forward, he was pretty antagonistic in the hearing itself, asking me somewhat antagonistic questions in a harsh way. But then something happened, and we ended up having a conversation, a serious conversation about two people who had different views on the death penalty. And I became convinced he was really asking questions to, he was not a lawyer, and he was seeking information. And by the end of this hearing, I don't think this would happen in today's world, quite frankly, because I don't think people change their minds during hearings. I'm just saying this as an observer watching some of these hearings. But I think I know he changed his mind. He changed his mind. And at the end, he said, in essence, I know we disagree about the death penalty, but I think you're well spoken about your reasons, and I think you'd be an excellent judge. So, Judge, good luck to you. He was actually the first person to call me Judge. And this came to a fruition because, as in the chapter of Death on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, I did go to Vietnam to participate in a judicial program with Vietnamese judges, but I also went to track down when my older brother, Jeff, had been killed in Vietnam by Cu Chi, which is right on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And I went to the Hanoi Hilton, where John McCain was imprisoned for many years and tortured, and what he had gone through. And when I was in college, there was a man named David Ifshin who was a couple years ahead of me, and he wanted me to talk at an anti-war rally, and I just couldn't, because my brother had died, and I just couldn't do it. I just wasn't ready emotionally or otherwise to do that. And he asked me a second time, and I also couldn't do it. And then later on, I heard about Ifshin in the news because he was on Life magazine with Jane Fonda going to Hanoi and doing anti-war speeches from Hanoi and castigating the people, the soldiers over there. And I thought Ifshin had gone way too far personally. It was right to be against the war. I was against the war, despite the fact that my brother was there. But I think you don't go to Hanoi while the United States is fighting and criticize the men and women fighting. Mm-hmm. Well, skip forward many years later, Ifshin is then gone to law school. He's now in the mainstream. He had worked on the Clinton and Mondale campaigns. And at one time, Ifshin met Senator McCain at some social function and apologized to him for what he had done. He said, I'm against the war, but I never should have gone to Hanoi. I never should have said things against you. And Senator McCain said, I accept your apology, and I hope you accept my apology, because McCain, had gone on the Senate floor to criticize him. And they became friends, and they formed the Democratic Institute in Vietnam. And tragically, Mr. Ifshin, in his 40s, with 3 young children, had a lethal cancer. And McCain stood by his friend and gave a beautiful eulogy. Mm-hmm. And I always think of that story and those notions of forgiveness and redemption. And McCain said something like, you can never waste time making things right in this life. And, you know, some of the chapters in this book, Burning at the Wire, about an execution in Alabama, where myself and many others tried to stave off an execution of our client, and Helter Skelter Son, which is a death penalty trial in the state of Maryland. Both those chapters at their heart reach for the notion of mercy and redemption and forgiveness, and how we could go forward. And I would like to think that this book, in some ways, as a theme, accomplishes those things.
There's a question on the chat, and I'm going to put it up on the screen. You might even recognize the name there, Ken Kunkin, who I think is one of your old friends from back in the undergrad days, maybe.
Grade school, John.
Grade school, okay.
Grade school.
Okay, we're going back about 80 years then, right? Anyway, Ken asks, Russ, how did you go about impressing President Clinton for him to make his first judicial nominee yourself?
Well, I think it's important to be very clear. I was the first judicial nominee, but that was a fluke, a complete fluke, in the sense that under DC law, once this Judicial Nomination Commission sends over 3 names to the White House by law has to select one of those 3 names in 60 days. So when President Clinton came on January 20th, he had 60 days from that date to select somebody. And usually they don't select judges until way after that, and they get there, assuming they have a good transition, to get things going. So they had to select someone in 60 days. And as it turns out, the person I interviewed at the White House was Ron Klain, who's now going to be the chief of staff for President-elect Biden.
Oh, interesting.
And, that was just a complete fluke, the way life goes sometimes. So I think the Clinton administration was, I don't know this for sure, of course, but before, I think they thought it was a good idea to have judges on the Superior Court with different backgrounds, because the last 16 years had been Republican presidents, and we had a lot of former prosecutors, excellent judges. Not one of them is a bad judge. I'm just saying they came with a different background. And I think the Clinton administration thought it'd be fair to have some judges with a different background coming from the defense side.
I want to go back to what you talked about earlier about that tough case where the person, where you sort of helped engineer a plea deal, but you were feeling a little hesitant about that. And one of the reasons that was behind that was the whole mandatory penalty situation. Do you, in general, have a problem with mandatory penalties? Because it definitely handcuffs you as a judge. You can't show the mercy that you might instinctively want to show.
I do, because I do have a problem with mandatory sentencing, and I think most judges do as well, because we just know that there are some cases that don't really fit, and justice is not being done on a mandatory sentence. I mean, the mandatory sentences really were shocking during the so-called war on crime, where the federal mandatory sentences were extremely harsh, especially against people of color. But mandatory sentences can always be harsh, no matter what the situation is, as it was in my case, rough justice. So a lot of the sentences I'm not opposed to. First-degree murder in Washington, D.C. is a mandatory 30 years in prison. First-degree murder is, premeditated, deliberate taking of a human life, or in the course of a designated felony. So I'm not offended by a 30-year sentence. However, you could commit felony murder, being the getaway driver in a robbery of a 7-Eleven, not knowing, expecting, or wanting there to be violence in the 7-Eleven, and the person who goes in ends up shooting and killing someone, and the getaway driver ends getting 30 years. And you could say that that's a too harsh a sentence for the getaway driver who didn't intend for anyone to die. So
and yet you're stuck.
Yes.
So what's the alternative? Are you doing things behind the scenes to try to get those kinds of laws overturned?
Well, we have guidelines in DC, which are really guidelines. So there's 2 questions. One is the guidelines are very helpful. So they try to cabin judges who are on either end of this sphere. Some are very harsh sentences, and some are very light. And the guidelines did a very long statistical analysis where the mainstream is. And so most judges in Superior Court now sentence within the guidelines, and that works. That doesn't take away the problem of mandatory sentences, though. Most of our mandatory sentences have been taken away. We used to have a mandatory sentence of 4 years in jail if you sold 1 rock of cocaine to an undercover officer. Mm-hmm. And the judges hated it, the prosecutors hated it, because you couldn't get any plea deals. No one was going to plead guilty and go to prison for 4 years for selling 1 rock of cocaine. So that our city council saw the folly of that and repealed that. So there have been less mandatory sentences in DC, but there's still many on the books, and occasionally there's going to be a case that falls between the cracks, and an injustice will happen.
Are you going to need to deal with your dog, or can we keep going?
I think we can keep going. I'm sorry for her, but there's no one else at home right now, so I hope it's not too much of a distraction.
Yeah, she doesn't have to go out or anything like that.
No,
right?
no, that's not
okay. Okay. Well, I mean, if that were the case, I'd be able to punt and vamp. Let's talk a little bit about memoir writing. Was that harder than you expected, or what did you learn from the whole process?
I didn't, in some ways, intend this to be a memoir. In fact, I actually don't, in some ways, call it a memoir. I call it Stories of Justice, because you're not going to where I went to high school and things like that. My intent really was to bring everyone in the justice system, and it's not just my story. It's the story of prosecutors and defense lawyers and victims of crime and those accused of crime, and in the non-criminal cases, social workers and nurses and psychiatrists and psychologists. It's a wide range of individuals who are trying to do justice. So in my view, the book is more about justice itself in all its forms. And although I'm writing the stories that are told in the first person, in my viewpoint of it, I really strive to bring everyone into it and show how this community of people is trying to serve justice. So I don't think it's my story. I think it's the story of those seeking to do justice.
What was the hardest thing about writing it? What did you learn in the process of trying to about writing a book about this?
Well, the hardest part was the more personal parts, really. The cases were the cases, and my views of the cases and how others interact and did things. And when talking about my brother, of which I had a very hard, difficult relationship, and explain what happened, why a 17-year-old with the consent of his parents volunteers for the Army. It required my mother and father to sign a consent form. And then at that time he was able to go to Germany, and we thought he'd be safe there, but he met some gung-ho guys who wanted to go to Vietnam, although if I had to guess, they had no idea where the heck Vietnam was. Right. And going over there. And so those were the hard parts. And that's really another motivation for this book, which is, I wanted to pay an honor and respect to my brother who became a hero in my eyes. And I wanted his story to be told. And I wanted the story of Alan Chaney to be told. And if I have a few minutes, I'll tell part of that story, which was I had tried to find the background of the records and what had actually happened to my brother in Vietnam, because the few records we had told us virtually nothing. I sent away to St. Louis, where they have the military archives, and received 27 pages, which told me very little as well. And then many years later, I sort of reached a dead end. Many years later, my sister was doing a research project with her 15-year-old son, Gabe, and went to the virtual wall. If you go on the virtualwall.org, I guess, there's a web page with every individual who died in Vietnam. And my sister saw a photograph of my brother on the wall, and it was posted there by an Alan Chaney. We had never seen that photograph, and it was very moving for us. And little internet sleuthing turned out that Alan Chaney was in the same unit with my brother. He had posted that photograph, and that he had actually been with him when he died, which is what I was always wanted to know. And I found out for the first time that he died was by a Claymore mine, which is a line that the United States said, but that the Vietnamese had turned around and used against us. Alan Chaney was wounded that same night, and they shared a helicopter back to base. And so Alan Chaney was an incredibly brave is an incredibly brave person, and was wounded 3 times in Vietnam. And he guided me when we went to Vietnam to go over to find out where exactly he died, which was 500 meters south of the junction of 5A and 600, which is a dirt road, mud road. So it sounds bigger than it was in a sleepy hamlet. So we went there and we paid our respects. And years later, my son and I went to go see Alan Chaney in Texas. And I was going to change his name for his own privacy, but I think he in his own way wanted the story to be told. He suffered from PTSD, and he's a lovely man. And in the acknowledgments, he's the one I give the most credit for, because in many ways it's his story too.
Mm. I'm really glad you put that into your book. And I want to switch gears a little bit. Talk a little bit about the Southern Center for Human Rights. What's that all about, and what was your involvement there?
Well, back then it was called the Southern Prisoners Defense Committee. It's now more well known by the Southern Center for Human Rights. And I went down with Steve Bright, who was the director, and Bob Moran. Three of us were from D.C., and Christy Freeman, who was did work in Georgia and Alabama. So it was just the four of us who started, really. And this was in the early 80s when the death penalty had been reimposed and individuals were on death row. And the Constitution only provides a lawyer for your trial and your appeal. After your trial and appeal, there's a whole series of other what's called post-conviction pleadings that you can do. And so we were going from state to state if an execution date was set, trying to get stays of execution. That summer, Brian Stevenson, who many of you may know, wrote Just Mercy, a fabulous book and a fabulous movie for that matter. Brian joined us as a second-year student from Harvard Law School for the summer. So it was a tight band, a band of brothers and sisters who were doing our best to stop executions through the South. Sometimes we were successful, and sometimes we weren't.
And what were some of the
now I don't know how many lawyers there are now, but there's probably at least 10 to maybe 15 lawyers. They have an infrastructure and a lot of support staff. They raise a lot of money. They can use more money. Mm-hmm. So if you're interested, the Southern Center for Human Rights, doing great access to justice for people all throughout the South.
What were some of the reforms that you recommended when you studied the whole death row wrongful conviction problem?
Well, we were taking the wrongful innocence commission type work, wrongful convictions, from the D.C. focus, and without sounding too much like a cheerleader for D.C., because we certainly have our issues with our criminal justice system, no question about it. But we in D.C. do a lot of things right that places a lot in the South, and not just the South, don't do right. So number one is provide lawyers. A lot of these individuals don't, even though they get a lawyer, they're not a well-trained lawyer. And if they get a lawyer, they may need an expert, but the state's not willing to pay money for experts. So the first thing is make sure you have a good, aggressive defense bar who has the proper resources. You may have a lawyer in Atlanta, I'm just using Atlanta as an example, but they're overworked and underpaid and without the proper resources, so they really can't give each case the care that it's due. Other things that cause wrongful convictions, false identifications. There's lots of things you can do to make sure that the identification process is carried out neutrally and fairly, and that we've implemented and jurisdictions around the country have implemented. Videotaping confessions. DC passed a law that when someone's in custody, when the police want to interrogate that individual, absent of very narrow circumstances, they have to videotape that. And quite frankly, everyone has a cell phone now, but they'll take them down to the station in an interrogation room with the camera going. So all this has added transparency to the process, so there are no more, I'm not saying there's no more, but it's less likely there to be false confessions. Also for, identification purposes. Junk science, there was a lot of junk science that people were attached to for many, many years. Now we've learned the hard way that some of the science really wasn't science at all. So it's been a revolution in the criminal justice system, and I think it only works if everyone's involved in it, not just the defense bar, but the prosecution, the police, the legislative. So we had all those people at the table, and although we disagreed on many things, most of the reforms we had were unanimous, that people agreed unanimously to go forward with reforms.
Now, when you became a judge, were there any insights that you got? I guess the question is, how did the reality fit with the expectations that you had about what it would be like to be a judge, as opposed to what it really was like? Were there any surprises?
Yes, there was. The first surprise, which is surprising that I'm saying this, was I didn't quite appreciate how many decisions a judge makes during the course of a day in a busy court.
What do you mean?
It just, before you walk into the courtroom, you're dealing with various pleadings, people want to get released, or in civil cases, motions to dismiss a case. There's just so many decisions you make even before you hit the courtroom. And as a trial lawyer, I saw a few judges who were indecisive, and sometimes they were wonderful people, and for the most part, wonderful judges, but they were risk adverse and didn't want to make decisions. And so that's the one thing that surprised me, how many decisions a judge makes during the course of each day.
Do judges go to judge school?
Oh yeah, we have lots of
Really?
we have a lot of training before you take the bench. We call it new judge training.
Okay.
DC I think does it right. We have a full 4 weeks of training where you talk with judges and you do mock role playing, sitting on the bench, and we go through various scenarios and forcing the new judge to make these decisions on the bench, wearing a robe and realizing how these decisions come about. We have continuing education in our court. There are a number of organizations that offer training. The National Judicial College is perhaps the most well-known, based in Nevada. So I've gone there several times for training programs. So sometimes it's a money thing, but at least in DC Superior Court, we do a lot of in-house training all year round.
Okay. So, what is it? If I'm not mistaken, you're actually switching gears and you're going to you're writing a novel. Are you working on a?
Well, I'm just starting it. It's probably too much in the. I always thought probably had I not gone to law school, I might have followed your footsteps and maybe be a journalist and a novelist. I love reading novels, so I'm a senior judge now, which means that I'm only sitting 3 months a year, so I have a lot more time. And now that Pursuing the Horizon is out, I'm taking some classes at the Writing Center with you as the teacher. So once again, if the novel is not very good, I'll know who to point fingers at.
Yeah, fair enough. One of the things I'm concerned about right now is that the internet is getting a little sketchy on me, and I'm afraid I'm going to lose you again. But I think we should do this again in the future, because I think there are probably a lot of things that we'd be able to talk about. But for now, I think I'd like to bring it to an end before it comes to an end without us buttoning it up neatly. So the book is Pursuing the Horizon, and I want to give people a chance to find it. Let's see. Probably the best thing that they can do is to go to your you can find the book on Amazon, but you can also go to 12tablespress.com, where you'll be able to get a copy of the book. And is the other book, the Tough Cases book, also there?
Yes, Tough Cases is also on Amazon. There's also an Audible version of it. It's on Tough Cases on any number of platforms. I can't remember them all right now. Pursuing the Horizons is pre-release. It hasn't had the publication date is coming up, but it's. I know some folks have been ordering it on Amazon, so I'm not sure exactly when it'll arrive, but it's there.
Good. Well, I definitely want to talk to you when when your novel is ready. And I wish you good luck on this one, or lots of grace, or whatever. But I'm glad we met, and it's been fun working with you. And you're a very, who knew that a judge would be so approachable? So thank you for taking the time
Well, thanks, John,
talk.
thanks for teaching, thanks for editing, and thanks for having me here.
Good. To be continued.
Okay.